What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is one of popular request. I get this question at least once or twice a stream. You guys comment, you guys ask me on Discord about it. So we're going to break it down into two separate videos because there's so much information, but we are finally going to be talking RNAV approaches and RNP approaches in the Airbus A320 family series of aircraft. Now, there's a lot of terms that are tossed around that some are interchangeable, some aren't interchangeable. We first have to talk about the basics of area navigation or RNAV navigation, and then hopefully it will clear some of the confusion up for you, and we're going to do two separate approaches in two videos. Today we're going to be focusing on RNAV approaches. So if this is something you're interested about, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, make sure your notifications are on so you are alerted the next time I drop the second video to this topic. Okay, let's discuss terms first. There's a lot of terms in aviation, and there's even more when it comes to RNAV and GPS approaches. Some are interchangeable and some are not interchangeable. So let's clarify some of the information right off the bat. First off, why do we have GPS navigation? Basic answer is it increases the airspace efficiency. Before GPS navigation, the only way to navigate your aircraft was by using the use of current ground nav aids such as VORs, NDBs, localizers, things of that nature to have the aircraft have something to track. That worked until airspace continued to get more and more congested. With the increase in air travel, there needed to be a more efficient way to move aircraft around. Enter RNAV navigation. RNAV, interchangeable with GPS navigation, interchangeable with area navigation, is a form of navigation that the aircraft, with the help of satellites and onboard computers, will help project a lateral path to keep the airplane navigating point to point without the use of ground-based nav aids. There's even current airways now that are solely dependent upon area navigation, and there are no ground-based nav aids on those airways. That continued to work, but however, airspace continued to get more and more congested, so there needed to be more efficiency brought upon the airspace system. Enter RNP navigation, short for Required Navigational Performance, increased the efficiency even more in the airspace system. What RNP does is it is a self-alerting and monitoring system that is on board the aircraft and will alert the pilot when the aircraft begins to drift from its tolerances. The tolerances are significantly lower, meaning more accuracy, than a regular RNAV navigation. There are several specifications to RNP, and they are dependent upon the phase of flight. What that means is depending on where you are, whether it's an arrival, an en route phase, an intermediate phase, an oceanic phase of flight, along with several more as indicated by this chart, the required navigational performance will vary. Without getting into too much detail and boring you much longer with all of these terms, what you need to know for simulator purposes is that for an RNP approach, you must have the required navigational performance on your aircraft. The Toliss in this example does allow for RNP approaches down to 0.3 nautical miles. This is a very high accuracy tolerance, and it allows for certain RNP approaches to be conducted. As far as the flight crew is concerned, there's really not much difference between flying an RNAV approach and an RNP approach, other than that the aircraft, when on an RNP approach, is going to have much tighter tolerances, and therefore the awareness of the crew must be that of extreme diligence to make sure the aircraft is doing what it is doing and the position is correct, because typically when you're doing a tight tolerance approach, it is because of some type of terrain or obstacle or airspace limitation nearby. Enter in the RNP for the Washington, D.C. runway 19 approach. You do not want to drift on that RNP approach because you'll be in prohibited airspace. You can insert the Lowy approach. When you start doing RNP approaches in high terrain, you must be on course and in the position that the aircraft thinks that you're in because there is significant terrain around you. Some aircraft are not capable of RNP, which means you cannot conduct an RNP approach, but you can still conduct RNAV approaches, which are still very accurate approaches to do. All right, so now that we've talked about RNAV and RNP, To sum all this up, the differences between an RNAV approach and an RNP approach are what the aircraft is capable of doing. If the aircraft has an onboard required navigational performance system, RNP, you can conduct an RNP approach. If you do not have that system, but you're an RNAV capable aircraft, you can conduct RNAV approaches, or area navigation interchangeable with GPS navigation approaches. Let's jump into the sim now and conduct an RNAV GPS approach into Tampa International Airport. Now, right now, the airplane is essentially on a downwind leg here for runway 1 right. We are at 250 knots and 3,000 feet. Pretty standard setup here when you're coming in for an RNAV. You'll come off the arrival, they'll vector you over across the airport and set you up for the RNAV should you need to do that. All right, so let's kind of go over our RNAV GPS approach chart here, and let's see if there's any major differences or things that we need to discuss here. So the briefing strip up at the top is going to be in the same format as any other approach that you're going to get on Jeppesen. However, you're going to notice some of the terminology is different. So right here, we have a WAS channel, 87105. You don't have to worry about WAS. We don't have anything capable in the sim that worries about WAS approaches. That stands for Wide Area Augmentation System. This is what we do want to carry about right here. This is the final approach course, 007. ANAZ, or ANAZ, however you want to say it, that is the final approach fix. The altitude that you should be at there when you're on the glide path is 2,600 feet. The LPV minimums, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here, are 290 feet, and everything else is pretty much the same. You got a touchdown zone, you've got your sector altitude, missed approach instructions, and of course, some other briefing information here. Now, as we look over the chart, it looks pretty much very similar to any other precision approach that you may fly, whether it be an ILS or something like that. But where it gets a little bit different is down here when we look at this profile view. Now, there's two terms that you need to learn the difference between the two. Some people use them interchangeably, which is totally incorrect. There are two terms when it refers to GPS approaches and ILS approaches that we need to get separate. Now, before we talk about the term, let's talk about the fundamental differences between a GPS approach and an ILS approach. A GPS, RNAV, or area navigation approach is based solely on FMGC computation of the Airbus aircraft. So there are no ground-based nav aids helping this airplane out fly a GPS approach. When you look at an ILS approach or an instrument landing system, you have both a localizer antenna on the ground and you have a glide slope antenna on the ground. Those signals are sent out, the aircraft receives them, and it tracks those signals down to the ground. Generally speaking, a ground-based navigation system is going to be more accurate in the ILS category and get you lower to the ground than an area navigation approach or an RNAV approach. Now, there's exceptions to those rules. We'll talk about that in a later video when we get onto RNP approaches. However, with this particular approach, when you're doing a pure RNAV approach, RNAV GPS runway 1 right, this approach will not get you as low as an ILS approach, unless, of course, you are LPV capable, which we are going to talk about now. All right, the LPV, or Localizer Performance with Vertical Guidance approach, is a WAS, or Wide Area Augmentation System, with GPS-based approach that is very similar to an ILS. There is a difference. The LPV approach, however, has vertical guidance, but it is still not considered a precision approach. APV, or approach with vertical guidance, is a term also used in lieu with LPV approach. An APV approach doesn't currently meet ICAO and FAA precision approach definitions, which apply mostly to localizer and glide slope transmitters which are on the ground. Now, LPV and APV approaches are very new, and I think they will become the future. Some of these approaches can get you down just as low as an ILS approach. However, in modern day aviation, as of right now, it is not the norm when it comes to airliner category aircraft and transportation. The WAS approach, or LPV, APV approach, is probably most common now in private jets and general aviation aircraft. You must have a WAS-capable receiver. A baro-aided GPS is not enough to get you approved for an LPV approach. So it's specific equipment that's required on the aircraft and technology, as well as some additional flight crew training. Again, mostly going to be commonly seen now in corporate jets and general aviation aircraft. I do, however, think this is going to become the norm for commercial aviation moving forward. So now that we know that RNAV is solely based on FMGC computation and GPS satellite data for the aircraft, let's talk about the vertical profile. On an RNAV approach, we have a glide path. On an ILS approach, we have a glide slope. The terms are not interchangeable and they mean different things. A glide path will be indicated by a green brick on your PFD, and it is the aircraft's computed descent path to get you from the final approach fix down to your minimum descent altitude within a normal position to land before reaching the missed approach point. A glide slope on an ILS approach is a fixed signal that the aircraft will capture and fly all the way down to the ground, and it is capable of conducting an auto land off of because it can track the signal all the way to the ground. Now, the fundamental difference again between glide slope and glide path: glide slope is from ground-based navigation aid. Glide path is from an internal computation from the FMGC of the Airbus. As we look at our profile view here of the RNAV approach, we can see the symbology is relatively the same. We have our final approach fix indicated here by the Maltese cross. We have an intermediate fix here going down to our missed approach point of Zelto. We also have another waypoint here. It says 1.1 nautical miles from 01 right, and there's a V there. We'll discuss that in a minute. We have a couple of numbers here. We got a 2 and a 1. We'll talk about that. And then we have an M. The M is the actual missed approach point for this approach. This missed approach point is at the beginning of runway 01 right. So the technical missed approach point for this approach is not a bottom altitude. Like when you're flying an ILS, you come down to minimums. If you don't see anything, you go around. On an RNAV approach, technically speaking, unless specified, the missed approach point is at the beginning of the runway. Now, there's a problem with that when you're flying modern-day jetliners. If we look at our minimums down here, wherever it may be, if you're LPV, you're 290, if you're LNAV, VNAV, you're 491, this is all MSL altitude here. The parentheses altitude is AGL. We're going to talk about that later. Either way, whether you're at 490 feet or 290 feet or 440 feet, if you're 400 plus feet above the runway as you cross the threshold, you are in what we call a non-normal position to land. In order to conduct a landing, you must be in a normal position to land. That means you must be able to continue visually down to the runway without using excessive descent rates. So, if our minimums are in the 400-foot range and the missed approach point is at the beginning of the runway, how are we going to be in a normal position to land? We have to come up with what's called a VDP, or a visual descent point. VDP indicated here by the V on the approach chart means you should be at your minimums at this position, so you are in a normal position to land and continue down to runway 01 right. And you can tell here when I look at this profile view, the glide path takes us down to the VDP, and then it actually levels out. Now, by definition, it's going to continue to show it going all the way down here to the bottom of the missed approach point, because if you're flying a different aircraft, maybe you're flying a 172, your VDP point is going to be a lot closer to the runway than if you're doing 150 knots in an Airbus fully configured to land. So the faster your approach, the sooner you're going to want to see that runway, because you have to conduct a visual approach down to the runway from there. That path is adjusted by the internal FMGC of the Airbus and is automatically calculated for you. There is an alternate way to calculate that. We can discuss that in a later video in advanced tips. But right now, if we look at the note here, we have a number 2. Number 2 means LNAV only. So if you're doing an LNAV only approach, your minimums are 440 feet, you must be at 1,300 feet at 1.1 nautical miles from 01 right. If you're an LNAV VNAV capable aircraft, which the Airbus is, because we already discussed that it can calculate its own glide path from the final approach fix to the missed approach altitude or the decision altitude with its internal FMGC, we're going to use this minimum, 491 feet. Now, for more advanced aircraft, depending on the capabilities of your airplane, you may conduct LPV approaches, which are called lateral plus vertical. Those actually get you down lower, which is very comparative to an ILS approach, but again, for the sake of this video, we're sticking with a pure RNAV approach. Real life, we're going to conduct an LNAV VNAV approach. Our decision altitude is 491 feet. The decision height, as indicated by the parentheses here, is your height above touchdown zone, AGL, which is 471 feet above the ground. Okay, so that was a lot to discuss, but we know that we don't have to worry about being 1.1 nautical miles for a missed approach here at 1300 because we know we're not an LNAV only. We know we're LNAV and VNAV. So we're going to let the FMGC compute our glide path all the way down, and hopefully by the time we get to the bottom, we can continue and we'll see the runway. We can continue descent visually down to the runway. All right, I'm going to go ahead and unpause the sim, and we're going to go ahead and continue to set up for the approach. So we'll come to our perf data phase here, and we'll go ahead and activate the approach phase. Our QNH down there is 30.21. Temperature was 20, and the winds were light and variable, so we're just going to put 0 for 0. Now, if we look here at our minimums box, again, we are going to conduct LNAV, VNAV. We are FMGC capable to compute our glide path, so we know we can do vertical navigation. DA is 491 feet, so we're going to place that in the MCDU. Alright, with our MCDU programmed, now we're going to continue to fly this approach. One thing to note is, since we are using area navigation or RNAV, we do not need to press our LS push buttons. The LS push buttons, landing system or localizer slope is how I like to remember them. We're not on a localizer and we're not on flying a glide slope, so we don't need to use our LS push buttons for this approach. Once you arm the approach, you will not press the second autopilot. You do not do coupled approaches for an RNAV. It's just going to be a single autopilot approach. In the ILS approach, when you're cleared approach, you hit the approach push button and you select both autopilots. That way you have redundancy. In this approach, not able to do that. Again, that's why our minimums are also a little bit higher, right? We have a little less accuracy on this type of approach. As far as flying the approach and as your speed management, I'm actually going to set up very similar to any other approach. I'll ride that 250 knots on my downwind. As soon as I get a base turn, I'm going to slow right back to 180 and begin to configure the airplane. If we look at our approach chart, we can notice here that the glide path angle is actually a little bit steeper than your traditional 3 degrees. This one is 3.5 degrees. So keeping that in mind, I'll probably make sure the airplane is ready to be dirtied up with landing gear in the final selection of flaps a little bit early here, as I don't want to be clean going across that final approach fix and descending down at 3.5 degrees. It may be a little tricky to get the airplane dirtied up. So here we go. We're going to simulate a vector here to the left, about 130 initially. I'm going to immediately dial my speed back to 180 knots, let the airplane start slowing down. Again, that 180 knot is just a technique. It's something that I use as a fail-safe speed, and especially if you're new to the Airbus, it's a good speed to really get you in a good position without being too fast. Some guys like to fly 210 or 200. Just my experience after years on the Airbus, especially in a 321, it can just be a little bit slippery, so I like to just drop it right back to 180. We'll continue that left turn to about 110. There's our VFE next minus 10. Let's extend flaps 1. Alright, at this point, a lot of times on a GPS approach, they'll give you a direct to on the approach itself. So we're going to simulate that here. We're going to go direct to Muti. We'll insert that, and we'll say we are cleared for the approach. So I'm going to press the approach push button, and we have what's called App Nav Strategy now active in the Airbus. We're also at VFE minus 10 plus some, so let's go ahead and extend flaps 2, give us a little bit more leeway here. Alright, at this point I'm looking for what we call the brick and the stick. The brick, or the vertical deviation glide path, is indicated right here on your PFD. It's full scale deflection, so you can't see it, but if you look at the lateral deviation down at the bottom, we're looking for that same boxed brick symbol. We're also looking for what's commonly referred to as the stick. The stick, or descent point, is indicated over here by this squiggly arrow just past the Anais intersection. What that signifies to us is that's when the aircraft is planning to begin its vertical deviation or vertical navigation down to the runway. Now, it's very important to note that the RNAV approach, or LNAV VNAV approach, is much like a straw. You're going to have a vertical and lateral navigation from the top, and it's going to track you all the way down to the bottom, and it's going to spit you out at the bottom. Once you get to the bottom, or your minimum descent altitude on your approach, the aircraft no longer has anything to track and will revert to basic mode. So it's very important that you disconnect the autopilot and flight directors upon reaching your minimums and commencing a normal position to land. More on this in the future of this video. Also, as we're flying inbound here, you can see that the AppNav strategy is active by it being in the green FMA column, and final is armed in blue. Once we are completely captured up, we should get what's called final app, short for final approach, which indicates that the aircraft is fully captured up with both LNAV and vertical navigation. All right, we're getting ready to turn on to the final approach course here. You can see the aircraft has now captured final app. Here is our brick beginning to come down to us. We know our glide path is a little bit steeper than the traditional 3, so I'm going to go ahead and set manage speed right now. I'm also going to go ahead and drop the landing gear. Go ahead and get that airplane to continue slowing, because I know once we nose over, we're going to be coming down a little bit steeper than our traditional 3 degrees. We'll extend flaps 3. Here comes our brick. Aircraft begins to pitch over. And we are tracking the RNAV approach inbound to 19 right. We'll extend flaps full, complete our landing checklist, notify the flight attendants.
2,500.
You can see we slowed up, no problem. We're on track. We'll go ahead and set our missed approach altitude, which in this case is 2,000 feet. So I'll go ahead and set 2,000 blue. Now, unlike the glide slope,
2,000.
and which may be dependent on your operator, but at some point you're going to need to disengage the autopilot on an RNAV approach. You cannot track this all the way down to the ground. Think of a straw. You've entered the straw at the final approach fix, and it's going to drop you out there at that VDP point, and it's now your job to get the aircraft into a normal landing from the base of the approach. What will happen is you'll hear a triple chirp, a mode reversion. Typically, you'll go into vertical speed and heading mode on the FMA, so you want to make sure that you disconnect your autopilot, your flight directors, and fly the aircraft down manually. All right, as we get ready to approach minimums here, and depending on your company op specs, you're going to want to disengage the autopilot. When you disengage the autopilot, it's critical that you also turn off your flight directors so the aircraft doesn't begin to sequence into the go-around or altitude hold mode.
500.
All right, approaching minimums. There's our minimums. Disengage the autopilot.
400.
Now look, if you do not turn off your flight directors, look what just happened. We've now transitioned to vertical speed and heading mode. This is like the straw that I talked about earlier. You've entered the straw at the final approach fix. The aircraft has now dropped you out at the final at the VDP point, and it has nothing else to track at this point. It is now your command to take over the aircraft and get it to land. We are in a normal position to land. We're slightly offset as planned per the RNAV course, but we need to get out of this mode, vertical speed, and heading. So it's crucial that when you disengage the autopilot that you also turn off your flight directors and continue down to land. If you do not, your auto thrust logic can get into a different phase that you think it's in, and it can cause issues for you as you approach to land. So again, very crucial at disconnecting the autopilot, you turn your flight directors off. My preference is I like to fly with the bird. Some guys don't. You can fly with the bird on or off. It's up to you. But it is very crucial that you disengage those flight directors. So we'll unpause, flight directors off, and I'll give myself the bird.
300.
And now we're looking at that 3-degree path. I'm going to kind of set up the airplane here so we're over the center line.
200. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, retard, 10, 5.
And there you have it, guys. There's your RNAV 01 right approach into Tampa International Airport. There's been a lot of information in this video. I hope some of it has helped you out. It did take a lot of time to put it together for you. I am going to be releasing the second video here, hopefully in the next couple of days, where we're going to conduct an RNP approach. We'll highlight the slight differences in that approach compared to this strict RNAV GPS approach. Anyway, guys, I hope you're liking the content. If you do, hit the like button for me, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, I'm V1. Stay safe, stay healthy. See ya!